Hey there, my name's Mark McCartney and welcome to the What is a Good Life podcast. Over the last 3 years, I've interviewed over 250 people around this question, not to prescribe you with the universal answer, but to help you explore this question yourself. I'm hoping the guests' musings, curiosities, explorations, and experiences will prompt your own inquiry into what this question means for you. Well, I'm also trying to share with you what I perceive to be more genuine expressions of the human experience and indeed more meaningful conversations. Which brings us to this week and the 106th episode of the What is a Good Life podcast, and I'm delighted to introduce our guest, Mona Sobhani. Mona is a cognitive neuroscientist, author, and entrepreneur. A former research scientist at the University of Southern California, she holds a doctorate in neuroscience from USC and completed a post-doctoral fellowship at Vanderbilt University. She's the author of the Ommie 2022 Best Spiritual Book, Proof of Spiritual Phenomena, a neuroscience discovery of the Ineffable Mysteries of the Universe, which is also the recipient of the 2023 Scientific and Medical Network Book Prize. In her newsletter, Cosmos, Coffee and Consciousness, she writes about science and spirituality, altered states of consciousness, emergent phenomena, and self-transformation. She is co-founder of the Phoenix Era, a multidisciplinary coaching practice for those seeking deeper meaning and connection. She is also co-founder of Exploring Consciousness, a community of curious scientists seeking to understand consciousness. Her work has been featured in the New York Times, Vox, and many other media outlets. In this enlightening conversation, Mona shares her experiences with reconnecting with a sense of a more meaningful universe and the impact that's had on her life. We discuss how to find inner peace amidst chaos, the role of synchronicity in shaping meaning, the influence of family and tradition, and the exploration of past lives and emotional release. This whole conversation invites you to explore meaning and reconnect with nature and the universe in a way that brings more flow, curiosity, and flexibility to your life experience. Look, I enjoyed this conversation with Mona immensely. It was a real joy for me to discuss spiritual phenomena and experiences with someone who is discerning as Mona. And so I think you're going to take a lot from this conversation as I did. And if you enjoyed this episode, please like, share, and subscribe if you're on YouTube. And if you're on the podcasting platforms, I'd greatly appreciate your reviews as well. Please check out the show notes below to follow more of Mona's work, as well as for the link to the podcast newsletter where you can read about the reflections that these conversations you are listening to are evoking in me. Well, you can also find ways for contacting me, whether that's for individual coaching, executive leadership team group coaching, or to sign up to my recently announced Silent Conversation courses. So look, that's all I have to say for this week. I look forward to carrying on the conversation with you next week. So without further ado, the 106th episode of the What is a Good Life podcast. Mona, thank you so much for joining me today on the What is a Good Life podcast. Since being made aware of your work by a previous guest, I've been really looking forward to having this conversation with you.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Wonderful. So as you're aware, the first question that I kick this off with is there a question you're exploring as you move through life?
Yes, there are many, many questions. Um, I mean, I think that like most Westerners, I feel like it was, if someone had asked me, I wouldn't have said this, but my goal was to be happy or to be successful or to reach a level of success where I would feel safe and secure. And then, of course, like many people going through life and reaching these achievements and milestones and realizing that those are not very good goalposts. um, Lots of clues along the way. So after realizing that, like I had a whole existential crisis and some spiritual awakening, which was hard for me because I'm a scientist and I didn't believe anything spiritual. But after all that, yeah, the main question that's been driving me for the last 6 years, 6 or 7 years, I would say, is kind of like what is the point of life, and but how do we come into a better relationship with that question? And so I think that, and like, what should the goalposts be? And it took me like a few years, maybe until maybe the last 2 years. I think the new question is, how do I resolve, um, the goal isn't happiness, but it could be contentment or finding peace really within. So, how can I do that in a way so that I can better serve others? Because I feel like we get caught up in our own happiness and we never address our own inner conflicts. And all of that makes you kind of like contract and turn inward. And I think that's what we see a lot in the world right now, is people don't feel safe and secure, and they have all these unresolved pains and hurts that they've accumulated over their lifetimes and never properly addressed. And then that stuff just weighs you down. And then you just are not very useful to yourself or to others. So I think, I really think we're seeing that play out on a large scale in the world. And I think, like, at least for my part, it's like you can't force everyone to do it, but it's like at least I can do it for myself. So I can find internal, like at least some calm in the middle of the storm, which this past week in LA has been an excellent exercise to see if I've made any progress on this front. And yeah, and I mean, I can report, I think I have. It's like when the world is in chaos around you, it's inevitable to feel fear. I think as humans, like our biology, we're hardwired to feel fear if your life is threatened. But I think that there are things you can do to mitigate that and kind of find a center within yourself. And so now that I've had a chance to really put that into practice, like I do think it's more important than anything else. Like, so you can pull yourself together and then ask, how can I help others who, haven't found that stable ground.
Just when you mention it there in terms of even what's alive for you now, can you give me a sense of finding even that center in the context of the last week even?
Yeah, it's, I mean, it really was this is the first time I'm reflecting on it too. So it's like, we'll
Right.
see what comes out. Yeah, it's like a sudden upheaval of, everything around you. And you do kind of go from that like rational, logical state quickly when your life is threatened to um, just fear and panic and like, oh my God, what am I going to do? And at first, and it depends, like everyone has different reactions to things. There is a sense of kind of freezing because you're confronted with a situation you've never encountered before and like frozen with the fear because you don't know what to do. And then quickly moving into, I guess, fight or flight. But it's, I would say, and this is okay. Like it's, I would say initially I had a hard time, or I just went into fight or flight, and like my nervous system was just on fire, and I was just panicked. And luckily, I was too panicked to even reflect on it and think, "Oh, you've done all this work. Like, why aren't you calm?" At least I didn't judge myself. Like, it was just happening,
Yeah.
um, and I was just, in the middle of it. And then, but every night. The first night was, so for context, in case anyone doesn't know, LA has multiple wildfires that have gone out of control and burned parts of the city, which has never happened before. So, and I lived near one of the zones where we were in danger. So it it's like the first night you really can't calm down. I feel like I fell asleep with a light on with the phone in my hand watching the fire app because they had this app up where you could track the fire and get live updates. And but then after that, the next day, I was able to. I have all of these techniques for regulating my nervous system, whether it's tapping or meditating, breathing. And so I started using them. And it's not like you can get back to, like I said, your biology takes over to some extent. So it's not like you're going to get back to, I'm in a peaceful forest meditating and everything's okay, because, and you don't want that to some extent because you do want to
Yeah.
be able to get activated and leave if you have to, but you can, you can get it back to a place where you're not just totally panicked and frozen, and you can get back to a level place. And so it was nice to see it in practice and to understand really that, to some extent the fear is useful and it's never going to be totally gone, but you just kind of work with it or mitigate it, um, and do the best you can. But yeah, I mean, it was a confirmation that if I can center myself, because you start watching the people around you to devolve, and they may not have these practices to center themselves. And so I watched some of the people around me deny it, ignore it, turn away, like they don't want to see images. I'm getting emotional of the city burned. And then ultimately, when the fire starts reaching them, starting to panic and being like, are they ever going to be able to stop it? What if it burns the whole city? And then, yeah. And there's almost an immediate reaction from me, like which I normally, or in the past, I think I would not have stepped up. I would have been with them. I would have just been like, yeah, this is nuts. Like, what do we do? And I think, but I could, after doing some of those practices, find that center and just be like, it's okay. Like, I mean, we have no control over what happens right now. And as much as we can, not worry, which is impossible, but to some extent, you can kind of not go into it. It can come up, but you can not go into it. You can feel it and then let it go. Like we should do that and just know that whatever happens, like we will rebuild and rise literally from the ashes. So yeah, it's been very educational, this whole experience.
Do you know, it's I always, out of all the people that I've interviewed or just some of the work that I do or the conversations that I have in general, I think it's always so interesting for someone that's quite genuine in their practice or has been exploring some of the things that you've alluded to already or had certain experiences. And as you say, it's not to deny or escape the experience of being human. As you're alluding to, like fear or suffering or any other thing maybe be occurring. But I think there's always something so heartening, I think, about or hearing about somebody. And there's been a multitude of scenarios that I've heard people describe this, what you're describing there. I don't know. There's something quite affirming about that because it's not just if you go to retreat somewhere and everyone's in this blissful scenario or something like this that people are proclaiming certain things. It's how do I experience this in life, like in the actual
Mhm.
in the in the intensity of life in whatever form that may take at the time.
Yeah, and I've always looked for that in spirituality or in anything I've explored. I always come back to, is this going to be practical? Is this going to help navigate life? And I've used that as a compass. So if something's not practical or useful, then I don't use it. Then I explore it and let it go. But like you're saying, like sitting in blissful meditation is useful to know that you can do that and you can access that state. And it totally calms your mind and body, and it's a wonderful feeling, but you can't sit in that all the time. It's not practical unless you're a monk. Very few of us are.
Yeah.
So just knowing that you have that at your disposal and you can go into it to calm yourself and come back is is good. But yeah, it really is like, how do you take these tools and make them, are they practical and useful? And yeah, I mean, I think a lot of them are, at least the ones and I'm always going to explore. I always want to find more. But yeah, they've been very helpful. Because, and I think that it's like some people go on spiritual journeys or self-development journeys to be like, I need to find, you know, peace and content so nothing bothers me. And I just don't think
Yeah,
that
yeah.
that is practical. Um, like I just think our biology doesn't work like that. I mean, like I said, it's like a fluctuation. You can get to a state and bring it back, but to never be triggered or never, like that takes a lot. That takes a lifetime.
Yeah, it's I always remember this thing by this talk by Ramdas once, where he said something along the lines of after 40 years of psychology, psychedelics, having a guru, meditating, fasting, all of these things, he doesn't think he's cleared one of his neuroses. And I remember the audience, because he's a funny guy as well, just gasping, but also laughing. And I think there was a mixture of, well, I hope we're all going to clear it up at some point. But he just mentioned
Hmm.
how he changes his relationship with their presence. And I think that's kind of what you're
Yeah.
pointing to here as well, which I find really beautiful. The acknowledgement there, just when you mentioned of a past in science, and then existential crisis, and then this maybe a conflict in seeing the world one way, and maybe post that, and just even as you're mentioning there, the experiencing and exploring of various tools. Could you give me a sense of just that kind of pathway somewhat for you?
Yes, yes. So I I think what did I say it was 7 years ago? Yeah, 7 years ago. I had started. I think I didn't think too much about life. Like I said, I had just like decided these were the goals. I got a PhD in neuroscience, and for a long time that was my driving force. Is just because PhDs are so hard, like you can't really focus on anything else. And so in my head, I was kind of like, oh, my life will start after this PhD, and it's like that did happen. I mean, I got it. I did a postdoc. I went, then I joined the workforce, and then once I joined the workforce after a few years, that's when the question in the morning started to come up of like, oh my God, is this what we do forever until we die? It's like just go to work and
Some
like
light talk over coffee, yeah.
yeah. Yeah. Like just yeah, like I had never thought about any of this before. And then every morning it started just like, oh my God, is this it? Like every day forever, this is it. And I liked my job is the funny part. It's not like I hated my job, but initially I liked all the jobs I had and until, they weren't working for me anymore. But that started to seep in and there in 2016, I just had it was one of those years where, like, one of those years where one thing after another went wrong, and I can't even, yeah. So just I had like a break, kind of, or I started to crack.
Yeah.
Actually, I didn't even let myself break yet, but it put a lot of cracks in me, and then in 2018 is when I really broke. I had a relationship that ended, and that was like the last straw. But I'm Persian as my background, and in our culture we have a tradition of divination, which is fortune telling, which is a terrible word because it has such negative connotations in the West, but it's part of our tradition, and my grandmother used to do it, and my mom does it. And I was a scientist, so I didn't really believe in it, but my mom would do it for me, and and I noticed that she would predict things like ahead of time, really specific, weird things that I would have no idea were coming, that she would have things that were like, let's say, related to work that I wouldn't update her, so she doesn't even know what I do. She still doesn't know what I do. So like she would have no way of even knowing what was going on. And that kind of what happened was some of her predictions were related to some of the things that started crashing around me, and I started getting, and that I think that probably contributed. I started feeling like I didn't understand the universe, and I had gone into science to understand the world, understand and control. That's what a lot of scientists go into science for. And so then my sense of understanding and control started to unravel because I was like, I don't understand how like this could be possible. And so I lived in cognitive dissonance for as long as I could until, like I said, life just kept coming at me. And I finally broke, and it went into like a dark, I felt despair for the first time. And then I lost hope. And I was not this kind of person. Like I was very upbeat and optimistic. And then that's when I started to explore. And it wasn't even willingly. It was like bit by bit, people around me were like, let's take you to a psychic in LA because I live in LA. And my friends had been, and I was like, that's ridiculous. I'm not going to do that. But then I went because I was like, oh, it sounds like entertainment. It'll be fun. And they blew my mind. But of course, I was still skeptical for a very long time. And so I thought I started looking into it and finding that there had been research on it, that a lot of this is like something that's been happening in humanity for as long as we've existed. And as much as Western culture has this story that we've debunked these primitive or primal or third world practices, it's not true. Actually, a lot of Western culture's first-rate science has proved that there's something there. So once I found that, I mean, you can imagine the identity crisis and like existential
Yeah.
crisis part two that ensued because my whole identity and self-worth was built around being a scientist, a serious scientist. And so that was a nightmare. But I kept interviewing people and reading and exploring and realized then I got to the whole literature on, oh, Western culture has adopted a physicalist, materialist worldview, but it's not the only worldview. There's a lot of other worldviews that include that, the idea that maybe something like our consciousness is an energy that pervades the whole universe, and so that matter and physical matter is not the only thing, which we already know from physics actually. But so I started to explore these ideas and I realized, actually what they teach us in science, because they teach you that there's no external meaning in the world, that our brains create all the meaning. And we look for coincidences, and then our brains create stories around the data points, which is true. Our brains do that. But that kind of that worldview in the West is that that's all there is, that we create meaning in stories and these, magical thinking based on our brains, but that there's not actually anything there in the external world, and that everything is meaningless and pointless, and that, or like the universe has no meaning, so everything is up to you to find meaning. And that is a very depressing worldview. But I didn't know that that was my worldview, or that there were other worldviews, or, like you're so in it, you don't even know that it's a thing. And
Yeah.
so once I started learning about that, I thought, oh, I don't have to have this worldview. Um, I could believe that the universe is meaningful, the way that most of humanity has believed for the time that we've been on Earth. And I could believe that we're in relationship with the universe and in conversation with it. I could believe that the universe is made of some sort of substance that has intelligence. I don't like the word God, but whatever. Source, like we came from somewhere or something. It's like I could believe whatever I want, because as I looked into the evidence, there was possibility for all of that. Like nothing had been proven. No one had proved only physical matter exists. No one had proved spirituality isn't real. No one had proved the universe doesn't have intelligence, because you can't prove those things. So once I explored all of that, I was like, oh, all these people, like my old self, talking in certainty about what the universe is or isn't, we don't know what we're talking about. like there's a lot of possibility, and that immediately alleviated a lot of existential pain, like immediately, just the idea that there were all these other possibilities. And then I started exploring some of the healing work. So like uh, I had heard this podcast. Chelsea Handler is a comedian here in the United States, and she used to be a super skeptic, and so she had just written a book called Life Will Be the Death of Me, which was resonating with me very much at the
Right.
moment. And she had a podcast, and then she had a psychic medium on, and I was like, Chelsea is a skeptic, like this is so weird. She has this like psychic medium on, because I wasn't on board yet with any of that at the time I heard the podcast. But this lady was like, described a framework of reincarnation, and we come here to learn lessons, which is what when I went to see psychics, they had mentioned that too. And I thought, and I didn't listen when the psychics had said it because I was not familiar with it, so it kind of went over my head anyway. I was like, okay, whatever. Like I had no concept for what they were talking about, so it went over my head. But then when I heard the podcast, I was like, oh, this sounds familiar. Oh yeah, like the psychics I went to mentioned that, and so I listened. And on the podcast they mentioned a book called Many Lives, Many Masters, which is about a psychiatrist who was very skeptical, atheist, Yale and Columbia educated, the kind of person I would look up to and respect. And he stumbles across past what ends up being past life regression. It's like a short, easy read. I ordered it not knowing what it was. I thought it was just a case study, but I read it and it was really fascinating. It was just like an easy story. But what really impressed me was there was a lot of the woman healed a lot from this work. And you hear the psychiatrist in the book grappling with like, he doesn't believe in past lives. So he's like, I don't know what's happening in these sessions, but he's like, I've tried every other modality for a year and a half with this patient and nothing has worked. And she's finally healing from all her extreme phobias. He's like, so whatever it is, like, I'm just going to keep doing it with her because it's the only thing that's worked. And so he would just put her into hypnotic regression and she would recount these lives where she like died in a flood or was trapped in a cave or whatever. And so her fear of like water went away, fear of the dark went away, like her anxiety, like whatever. So there was a correlation between whatever happened in the sessions and her phobias, and she started to get better. And I thought that's practical and that's useful. And that's interesting because in neuroscience, we don't have good models for mental health, even though it may seem like we do from the media, we don't. We don't have a good understanding of what causes it. um, and we don't have a lot of great healing modalities. So that fascinated me, and I started reading everything I could about it and trying it. I went and got some sessions, and it was really intense, but very healing. And that was that was the beginning of the journey. But I'll take a breath here, have some water, and you can figure
Yeah, well, there's so much that resonates, and so many kind of intriguing lines that have emerged there. The idea of seeing someone potentially psychic and scoffing at it, and then being humbled by it, resonates very, very deeply with me. In my own experience, the something you said that was really beautiful, even just your within your family, like your mother and your grandmother, in terms of them being able to see things or sense things or inform you of things occurring before time. Like, just even go there briefly, like I don't know, there's so many times in the last, I don't know, 9 to 10 years or something, that my worldview has almost had to crumble. Not always comfortable, obviously, but just with that and it being kind of so close, like literally being within the home. What was that feeling like? Because I think it's one thing to discover these things from outside, but within your home, what was the kind of resonance or significance of that?
Yeah, it's more powerful, obviously, because even when I was going to see these psychics or intuitives, um, there is a lot neuroscience and psychology wise that they can pick up off of you subconsciously. So although I have to say, like, I mean, the things they said were, I counted, like I recorded them and I took notes and I counted the variables that they would be right on, the number of things they would get right. And I would kind of do the stats in my head of like, what are the odds that they would get 7 variables right about this event in my past. But when it comes from your mom, you know, I know she's not trying to impress me. She doesn't care. Like she does, there is the chance that she could pick up a lot off me, even if I'm not telling her things. But the thing that got me was the future stuff. And the other thing, was what was to this day still I find very interesting. She would say things, uh, small things about situations that were extremely meaningful to me, but that to somebody else looking at the situation, they would never pick up on, or like it wouldn't be the thing. And those were the things that gave me chills because I'd be like, I've only ever thought that in my head, that like this is what's important about this situation or something like that, or this feature about this person. Like those would really creep me out. She would know features, and I'm like, so when that happens, and like I said, I went back and forth in my head a million times about like what could be the um, scientific explanation for this. But yeah, I came up short because of the detail. And I think when it's from a family member and it's your mom, I mean, yeah, my mom doesn't care about impressing me. Um, she's not making money off of it. She doesn't have a reputation to uphold. It's not like I'm going to leave and tell anyone about it. Like she doesn't care. It's like in the privacy of our own home, between us. And so I think it is much more powerful because you're just like, there's no motivation here for her to lie. So a lot of that like narrative of people being frauds or trying to deceive you is taken out. Um, we do the scientific studies to rule out the other side of that, which is the subconscious cues and stuff. But like I said, there have been a lot of studies that have shown there are small effects, but they're significant.
You've mentioned the word meaning there. You also mentioned along this path, coming into a sense of appreciating that there's a meaning, not just a self-made meaning, that there's a conversation, a relationship with the universe. Can you
Right.
describe kind of what that shift was like in the sense of, coming from a very different perspective and almost like a quite isolated sense, or
Mhm.
when you think of a potential of feeling like a belonging, if I'm just making stuff up as I go along and there's no commune or
Mhm.
connection with something else,
Yeah.
that feels quite like isolated or untethered or something to that extent. Could you elaborate more on what
Yeah.
that experience is like for you?
Yes. So when I was in college and when I was younger, I was much more. I do think people are connected to the universe now, and I think we become disconnected when we lose disconnection with ourselves, and that happens as you grow up because society tells you all these things, and you come to believe them and whatever. So when I was younger, though, and I was in college, I was much more in tune, and I I always like felt I had a lot of synchronicities, a lot of very powerful synchronicities and coincidences, like out of this world. My roommates and I used to document them and talk about them because we were like, this is so weird, like that these things, and between us, like all of us too, just it wasn't just me. But I always felt like I would never ever have put it in these words. Like I was not meta, I didn't think about it, but this is just how I lived was if I found like money on the floor, like I would know I would need it later. Like I just kind of knew things. Like I knew when the right time was to email someone, or like I was much more in sync because I didn't think about it, and I would never have called it spiritual. But then after I started grad school and I started getting that indoctrination, literally like the training about the worldview, a lot of that fell away. And and my PhD program was 6 years, so by the end of it, it was all gone.
Right.
And there was like no sense of kind of like, I mean, it was still there a little bit, but it was definitely like my left brain came online and was saying, this seems meaningful and connected, but it's just you creating a coincidence. Like you start to rationalize it and explain it away. And and I mean, and that's when I really started to get depressed. So like, I like, and it's in, and you can tell these stories in different ways. You can see like the first time I told the story, I said I ended my PhD, I joined the workforce, and that's what depressed me. But I could also say I got disconnected from myself and what I wanted and what I thought was important, and as a result, disconnected from the universe. And I was very, I would say, out of flow. And you can't thrive under those conditions. But yeah, and so after grad school, like thinking there's no meaning in the world, I would say before that I lived in a meaningful world where it's like things that happened were connected to other things and everything felt meaningful. Like I found that quarter and I, later in the day needed exactly like 25 cents. And it's like, oh, here you
Right.
go. I happen to have found a quarter earlier today. So it felt like that. And then that started to fall away. But I couldn't, because I had been so, like trained in this way, specific way, it was hard to let meaning back in. Like it was so hard for me to believe that there was meaning, external meaning, because they did a very good job of training you, of being like, these are the ways that your brain lies to you. And so one and my it goes back to my mom's readings actually, because yeah, like I said, she would pick up things that were meaningful to me about a situation, and that was interesting to me because, like, if we're doing an experiment and I'm looking at things statistically, of like when we do statistical models, we'll have, let's say, three variables. You do the experiment to see what percentage of each variable explains what happened, right? And
Right.
um, so if you're looking at a situation that you're trying to explain, it's kind of like that. Like it's broken down into these variables, and my mom does the reading. She picks up on the thing that's like the most meaningful to me, but that, like I said, externally, probably nobody would think is important. And that's what I found fascinating because I was like, oh, like if I had three variables related to the situation, and one of them is like 60%, and the other two are like, smaller percentages, she got the 60% thing. And that's what
Right.
happened with the psychics too. Like they would pick up on these things that were just really meaningful, and you're like, interesting. And so when I started going into the literature, I found, I think it was actually, I mean, I read a lot of things, but Richard Tarnas is a cultural historian who wrote a book called The Passion of the Western Mind, which goes through the entire history of like Western culture and how we got to where we are. And he wrote another book called Cosmos and Psyche. And it was in his writing that he talks about how humanity has lived for millennia in relationship with nature and with the universe, and how they find meaning in everything, like in the stars, in the wind, in the weather, like the flock of birds, like indigenous cultures have a lot of relationship in that way. And he explains how that's possible by saying there could be a link between cosmos and our psyches, and that, as within, so without, and kind of goes through the whole history of Western culture, explaining all the cultures who've had these viewpoints and where did we lose that in Western culture. And it starts with Descartes and the scientific revolution, where that separation starts to happen. But the way that he described it, it just made sense to me. Like it was so weird when I read it. I just had goosebumps, and I was just like, oh yes, like that is the way I used to be and used to live, and that is how it feels. It feels like your body is very smart. It's very intelligent, right?
Right.
So like when you get goosebumps or you feel something very strongly, like it's important. Like sometimes you just have these knowings of, I know that's true. And that's how I felt when I read that. I thought, oh yes, that makes so much sense because this is how I used to live. Like it feels like we are connected. Like even though our bodies end here, like it feels like we actually extend, or the environment extends into us, or we're connected. So um, that turned me back on to paying attention to things that were happening around me and in my life as meaningful, as hints as to what's going on within. And that's been like the most useful practice of all of the things I've done, is just like, I'm encountering this pattern is like showing up for, let's say a few days or months, and I'll have to sit and be like, all right, what's this? What is this? What's within me that's being expressed in my environment?
This that resonates so strongly. Like even the sense of a truth almost being felt, um, in especially in the sense of goosebumps. You mentioned chills earlier when your mum or grandmother might have said something,
Yeah.
and I think that as a guiding tool or principle, I think that's massively informative in my life, and even just the acknowledgement of other parts of the world, how they'll pay such close attention to the kind of interconnection of everything and take meaning from it. Like, it's when you mentioned earlier, even just the sense of potential, feeling depressed when you fell out of connection with that.
Mm-hmm.
To me, I really do think, and it's not for me to push my views on anyone else, if you know what I mean, but I see that as being really substantial in terms of how connected or how much at home. Like, it's strange that there's a worldview that has left us feeling in conflict with our environment, and like we
Mm-hmm.
don't even belong, or that we're not even at home in this world. And yet it's still the kind of the most prevalent view in interpreting the world in our parts of the world. But this,
Mm-hmm.
even just this element of synchronicity, what's that been like to let back into your life? This is, I don't have a clear perspective on synchronicity as such. I know it when I'm experiencing it, if you know what I mean. But it's I don't know. It almost gives me the sense of, while it doesn't tell me what my future is right now, I'm where I'm supposed to be, or something of that
Right.
nature. How do
Yeah,
you kind of experience that?
that's exactly right. Yeah, I usually, I have, yeah, okay, when I was in college, I used to say that. I was like, I always take these moments that like they give you goosebumps, or they'll be just these moments of, I don't know, like, yeah, connection and meaning, to feel, no, as a, confirmation or validation, yeah, that I'm on the right path, I would say. And I mean, Stan Groff is a psychiatrist who writes about some of this, or and he's still alive, but he's like in his 90s now, and he tells this really amazing story though, because I think I used to think, because like I said, I had this I mean, you're young and naive, and like so I had this idea like happiness is the goal and getting what you want is a goal or whatever, and so I would take synchronicities as I'm on the right path to that, to getting what I want. And Stan Groff tells this amazing story of like how he met this woman, and there was like every beautiful synchronicity around their wedding day. Like there was a rainbow, and like it was stormy, but then there was a break in the storm, and like it was so perfect. But then the relationship ended, and I think not well, or I can't remember the story exactly, but he says it's like an excellent example of how you can be in flow. It doesn't mean that everything's going to be beautiful and what you want. It just means you are where you're supposed to be, and that whatever happens, probably need it on your path to get whatever for your evolution, I guess. But yeah, so I do want to make that distinction only because I learned that, and he was right. Like I do feel that now. It's like it's still a nice confirmation or validation, but yeah, just keeping in mind it doesn't mean it's all going to be roses.
But I think this is I think this is hugely important, because often, I've been in spiritual circles, shall we say. Like, I've taken a couple of sabbaticals, once before to India, once to Peru as well, for an extended period of time. And I often heard people who had rejected, the Western models, but then as validation or confirmation of that, they'd use material or financial metrics to confirm that, they were doing the right thing, or, that they were getting what they wanted, if you know what I mean.
Mhm.
And I think that misses the point. Like, I think
Mhm.
living this way, or knowing you are where you're supposed to be, essentially, is the reward in itself. It won't, as you alluded to before, it won't make me impervious to the fluctuations of the human experience.
Mhm.
But it moves beyond the outcome then, I think. And I think when we're experiencing life, when it's beyond the significance of the outcome,
Mhm.
it's just literally from those moments of of goosebumps. Maybe it is a beautiful fucking rainbow as well, but
Right.
it doesn't mean, it doesn't mean that it's going to be just this clear cut thing. Like when you mentioned past life regressions, which I'd love to ask you about, but I don't have a clear model as to how this all comes to be, like whether I come back multiple times. But one thing I have to hold in my mind, if that is a potentiality, is like, what if my purpose this time is to be absolutely humbled, in a various or in a myriad of different ways. Do you know what I
Yeah.
mean?
Oh,
And but even
yes.
yeah, so but even holding on to that offers some sense of freedom, I think, in
Yeah.
the experience of life, even while getting caught up in life, if you know what I mean. But
Yes. No, go on.
please, no, no, please.
I just, sorry, that just is so like my path also. It's funny. I just like feel like I've come here to be humbled.
you know, for you, just that reference to the to past lives, like, can you just elaborate on what that experience was like, or what even coming to some of that information has been like for you?
Yeah, I mean, initially I was like, no. That's how inflexible I was. Like this is this is my worldview. I am a scientist. There's no such thing as a soul because what is it made of? Carbon, oxygen, like show me what it's made of. And how could it recycle? That didn't make any sense to me. And it's very hard to explain it from a materialist, physicalist worldview because we have no model for what could that be. But it's
Yeah,
funny because when you branch out into other philosophies and worldviews, and like in philosophy, which they don't teach us in science, we have to teach ourselves. There's materialism and physicalism, which is the world is all physical matter. But there's other things like panpsychism, which is that everything has consciousness, or idealism, which is the whole world is mental, and there's no distinction between the mental and the physical, which is what we have. We have a dual worldview right now, giving more importance to the physical. So when you hit those worldviews or those philosophies, it becomes possible. You're like, oh yeah, like consciousness, which as a neuroscientist is our like in neuroscience is our biggest problem. We can't explain consciousness. We don't know how a mental life that we can't measure, but that is our whole existence comes from physical matter. We don't know how that happens, and we can't explain it. So then there's all these models of, well, what if consciousness is an energy that pervades the universe and that ports in to vessels, which are bodies, for a while, and then when the person's body expires, the energy goes back into the universe. Um, but it's a little different than physicalism, which does say energy never dies, that your energy goes into the universe. It's saying that consciousness, it's an intelligence, it's a personality, it's a entity in and of itself, but part of a whole, right? The whole field, but that can come down and experience things and then go back into the whole, and it can do that as many times as it wants because it's eternal, because energy never dies. And so once I hit those worldviews, I thought, it's possible, I guess, but you have to do like coming from the Western mind. I mean, it took me a long, especially from a neuroscience background, it took me a long time to open to that idea. Because, yeah, I mean, before I hit the philosophy literature, I was just like, no. And then once I hit the philosophy literature, I was like, maybe. Um, and it just took a lot of reading, um, other kinds of evidence to open to the
yeah,
idea. I mean, at this point, I feel like there's so much evidence that we can't explain with physicalism, with our normal science model, that I think it's probably the wrong model. Because if you have to ignore a lot of human experience, then it's just not a very good model. And there's a lot of, the stories of reincarnation come from, young children, age between sometimes between the ages of 2 to 5, they'll have memories of past lives. And the University of Virginia has done research on those children and documented and confirmed the identities of the previous person. Like they've done all this amazing research. Then there's stories from near-death experiences, who people who are like, oh, and past life regression as well. So you get a lot of the same spiritual framework reported from people in altered states of consciousness. It's not always the same, but it's by and large a very similar story of like, we come here to learn lessons and we repeat this through lives. And we're supposed to learn love and compassion and charity, which we're failing at, and empathy. And I mean, when I came across this, it's so outside of the Western, like that. It's so hard to grapple with because you're just like, so first I have to believe there's a soul, then I have to believe that it has a personality and that it comes back all the time and that it actually wants to come learn all these really hard lessons. Like, who would want to do that? And
Yeah.
then that the fundamental thing of the universe is love, and you're like, oh, hippie bullshit. Like, but the more that it's just that for me, I had to hit multiple types of literature. And then, of course, personal experience is also a very powerful driver. So when you start, so I did a past life, I've done a few past life regressions, and they're very emotional. So it's funny, I wanted to do a bunch, but they're so emotional that I have to like prepare because
Right.
it's gonna be like a whole week after of like it's just weeping. And they I've done three, I think, and they're very powerful. Are they real past lives? I don't know, but frankly, I don't really care because what you should go into it wanting is to release emotions, just, unburden your heart. And it's very good for that. Of all the methods I've tried, it's like one of the biggest emotional releases that you can have. So I think it's possible now. But like I said, it's very hard to grapple with if you're coming from the Western model. But yeah, I mean, I think it's totally possible.
What a beautiful expression to unburden your heart. Um, I haven't had. I've had lots of unique experiences and different. Whether it was in meditation, psychedelics. To be honest, even just reading quantum physics sometimes gives me these feelings of like,
Mm,
whoa, I kind of can't make any. I can't cognitively feel my way into this, but it feels very strongly from it. Can you give me a sense of what? And I'm aware of the concept of past lives, but just what is the significance of it, or the quality in the felt experience of it? Like, because
mm,
I've done work with people that see entities or energies that I had a very good feel for in terms of their integrity of how they show up in life. And so while
mhm,
that's not my modality, I fully appreciate that it's how they're perceiving the world, and it has
mhm,
something to offer to me. And often it reduced me or brought me to tears, if you know what I mean, some
mhm,
of the things that they were
mhm.
pointing to. So I'm more than comfortable with that, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
As my guide as to whether there was any maybe some truth in it. For you and your experience of past lives, how was that experienced for you?
Yeah, so the way that it works is that you go into like a little, that you just relax basically, you get into a deep, and had have been meditating for a long time, and I have like a vivid, I can visualize in my mind really well. I know some people can't. So it was easy for me. It's not easy for everyone apparently to do it, but yeah, went into a very relaxed hypnotic state, and then I think you can, I yes, the first time I did it, I think I wanted to know about a particular relationship in this life. And then I think the other two times I just said, whatever, like my psyche or body wants to heal, let that come up. And you just, the therapist will just kind of ask you, what do you see? And we'll kind of guide the session. And what happened for me is the images just would come. And it's not like you're imagining it because it's more like you're watching it happen, like watching it pop into your head. And so like I said, I had been a meditator, so I was pretty good at letting go of not trying to anticipate what's going to come. But so I was just watching what would pop in, and it surprised me how vivid and specific the images were. And like she would just ask questions, and I would have answers, and I was just like, "What is happening?" But I mean, actually, you're so in a relaxed state, you don't even that doesn't even cross your mind. Like at least I was. I was just like it was just happening, and you end up telling this story bit by bit because like she'll ask what where are you now, who's around you, what are you wearing, what year is it, and so it unfolds, and I would say there's moments during the story that can be emotional, but really at the end, at least this is the way that I had it done for me, was you die in the life, and then at the end your soul goes to, I don't know, some in between space, and you meet the souls of the other people who are in your life. And my therapist would say, okay, is that person, what are they saying to you? And I would tell her, like they would just come, and then that's when I would start like just weeping.
Yeah.
And she'd be like, what do you want to say to them? And then I would say something, and then I would just, it was like the most emotion, and it wasn't like a cognitive, like, oh, this is sad, like this imaginary fantasy person in my head lost a child and she's talking to them. It wasn't like that. It was like a deep emotion from my body that I couldn't even
Wow.
control that just came pouring out. And so, yeah, they're very powerful. And that afterward, I spoke to my therapist, who's she's amazing. And she said that's how you know it's probably real. And she's very good because she's like, maybe 50% of the time people are making it up, but she's like, it doesn't matter. The point is the emotional release. And she's like, people who do this work believe in it though, because the depth of the emotion that's released, you can't make that up. And that's not easy to access, even in regular therapy. In general, it's not easy to access that kind of deep emotional release. So it's something about the state that allows that. And yeah, it's very healing. And it helps you understand current relationships in your life sometimes. Like if they're people, like she'll say, oh, is this somebody who's in your current life? Like, does it remind you of anyone? And then that happens sometimes. And you'll be like, oh, and suddenly you have that's, and it takes a while to process, the whole thing because you have to go through all the dynamics of all the relationships you encountered in the past life and kind of work through, what's going on in this life with that person.
But it's, and I don't want to abdicate myself of of just making certain choices in life, but it does it does sometimes. And I know there's like many things obviously that we've inherited from evolutionary biology point of view, just how our brain functions, all of these kind of things. But it is puzzling to me sometimes when I have such acute awareness of what I perceive to be a potential trigger for something. I've watched this certain pattern of behavior over and over and over again. And yet still I could make a similar choice. It does feel sometimes, and I'm not directly attributing to this, but it does feel sometimes that I'm working with incomplete I don't know, even data sets or experiences or something, even to make sense, to make like a
Yeah.
fully embodied sense of what my present experience is. It doesn't, that for me doesn't point to anything else as a certainty. It's just an experience of watching my experience in life, I guess, or just watching myself, my own conversation or engagement with the universe.
Yeah. I've spent a lot of time thinking about it too because I can pop into different frameworks, right? And I'm like, oh, if I stay in a neuroscience materialist framework, I can say these are, past, it's conditioning, right? You
Yeah.
were born with a blank slate, you've encountered experiences throughout your life, and then your brain starts to um, create these relationships, these correlations between this experience and this reaction. And combined with psychology, the whole ego, you're protecting yourself from hurts and whatnot. I could explain all of that with brain networks, and it's hard to break out of patterns because it's hard to change your neural networks, right? That takes time and
Yeah.
practice. You could explain it with psychology in that way too. You can explain it with energy. You could say they're thought forms, right? Some people say that you have these thought forms or behavioral patterns that are in your field. Like if you go to someone who's very into energy work, they'll explain it that way, and they'll try to remove it, or and they could be things from you've brought over from past lives or whatever. Um, and you could also, what's the yeah, well, I could say that. So it's there's and it all describes the same thing, right? They're all just different stories. Um, but all I found, I've tried a lot of the methods used. So I've tried psychedelics, and I tried breath work, and I tried past life regression. I've done EFT. I've tried everything just because I was curious to see like what works, and what are these things. And and I do. And also, I was looking for something because I'm a Westerner. I was like, what's the fastest way to plow through these patterns and emotions? um, but like, yeah, of course, that
That
is when
doesn't
I
resonate at
realized,
all, obviously.
yeah, yeah. I mean, and that was one of those places where I was humbled because it's like I'm gonna do a past life regression every week and plow through these, and then I was humbled by it because I was like, oh no, I don't want to do this every week. Like I'll be depressed like forever. Like this is so hard. So and like sometimes you don't. Oh gosh, actually recently I think I was in one of these healing things with a friend who wanted to try this method he was being trained in. I was like, okay, I'll be your guinea pig. But then I got put in a past life or whatever. Like the images that were coming were like I was like tied to a stake and I was going to be burned. And I was like, honestly, I don't want to go through this right now. So honestly, I'm already going through a lot. I don't know that I want to relive this. So I think I just kind of was like, look, I can't today. And he was so nice about it. He's like, that is totally your choice. Like that would be awful to live through. You're right. Let's not do that. And so I think I think that like we have these naive assumptions we can plow through it, but it's like some of it is really heavy.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm like you can only take so much at once. And um but yeah, there's different ways to describe it, right? Like you can pick any narrative you want, but I think that regardless, I think I think the way that normal psychology tackles it is not very is helpful. I mean, I think cognitive behavioral therapy is great, but I think it helps the symptoms. It helps you not drop into the energy. But I think you
Yeah.
need the like deep emotional work also, like the actual releasing and breaking the patterns.
Yeah, I once again I've said it a number of times, but that resonates definitely a lot with my experience. Look, just Mona, given kind of where you've been describing where you've gone with this kind of exploration through life, initially to thinking, how can I be happy? How can I be successful? To, going through existential crisis, spiritual awakenings, to more kind of central question of how do I almost find my center? How do I feel some sort of contentment within this kind of ever changing fluctuation? Becoming aware of more kind of ideas of divination, even through your family, exploring with so many modalities, letting go of such, let's say, materialistic or Western worldviews, um, opening yourself up to the experiences that can cause both, wonderfully connecting, but also there can be despair in that. But ultimately, finding yourself back to some sort of sense of meaning and connection with meaning, both an internal and an external one as well. Being in conversation with the universe, conversation or in relationship with so many different things. And then even just this exploration of past life and just this beautiful expression of kind of unburdening your heart. Um, so many questions I still probably have to ask you at another point from this conversation, but the one that I'll ask you right now is what is a good life for you, Mona?
Mhm. I'm glad, wait, sorry. You had mentioned earlier something that I wanted to comment on, so you're bringing it back. So I think, yeah. Well, to just answer that question, for me, a good life now is to actually be able to be in flow with the universe. And that is where the humbling comes in. Because I think or I mean, this is not like a insight that I've had. I've had many intuitives tell me this. So, but it is becoming like an embodied understanding slowly. I'm a slow learner. But that yeah, like basically to be flexible and in flow is probably the goal, because I think we've become so rigid, and especially in our ideas, of what we want or how we want things to go. And that is where we're humbled, right? Is like life doesn't conform all the time. And even if you have money and power and you can, to some extent do that in a lot of areas of your life, it's not going to be 100%, right? Because we're still at the whim of the universe, of nature, as I've seen in the last week. Like, not everything is
Yeah.
controllable and stoppable. And just, it's that flow of like moving off your center and being able to come back. I mean, that's the most useful thing. That has, for me, the definition of a good life is I think it's inevitable to be knocked off center, and it's just being able to find your way back, which sometimes I think takes longer than other times. But even being flexible in that, being like, that's okay. I think a lot of it comes from the judgment. I've been realizing is we just judge everything, how things are, how they should be, how I'm reacting, where I should be. Like, it's a lot of just judgment. And I think, like, and then judging and then the shame that follows,
Yeah.
or the I'm not good enough or whatever. And that seems to be the core of a lot of suffering. So I think for me, it's just coming into relationship with that, of like, maybe it's inevitable that I judge myself, but then constantly coming back to that's the like being thrown off center, but then coming back to the softness, for yourself and others, of being like, well, that's part of being human.
Yeah, but this is so beautifully put, and I even love the expression like flow for sure, but even just the subtlety or suppleness almost of flexible too, and as you're describing there, like the really human. It sounds beautiful, by the way, being knocked off center and repeatedly coming home. Like there's something like about many lives, even in walking that path many times, even within this present life, but the lack of judgment in that movement to and from, like I think that's absolutely beautiful as well. So Mona, look, thank you so much for joining me today on the What is a Good Life podcast, given the experiences you've been experiencing over the last week, especially, also just for the wonderful insights you've shared, the wonderful anecdotes, and it's been a real joy for me to speak with you today.
It's been really nice to be with you. Thank you for having me.